Hi, everyone. I'm Marilyn, CEO and founder of Cosmic Centaurs, and your host for this third edition of the annual Cosmic Conference, all about the employee experience. To better understand EX, we will be exploring the conference through a variety of lenses: internal comms, employee engagement, flexible work, onboarding and offboarding, recruitment, upskilling, retention, office design, organizational strategy, and so much more. The conference is divided into 3 tracks. The first one is EX strategy, then we'll be moving on to EX touchpoints, and then lastly, we'll be talking about the human factor at work. And we are now in that first chapter around strategy. We call this conference a conference sprint because it's going to be running over the next 3 weeks. So you can see the dates here at the bottom of our screen. And the idea was really that we're hoping that by dividing this into smaller increments that you can consume every day, that at the end of the 3 weeks, you'll really have gained a new perspective on employee experience. So until October 21st, we will be joined by thought leaders that will share insights, experiences, and perspectives on the employee experience. All information about the session, guests, and topic can be found on our conference website, which the team will link for you in the comments in case you don't know where that is. And before we begin, as always, please show us some love, give this video a like, share it with someone who you think might enjoy it. But more importantly, please go ahead and share your thoughts, share your comments, ask questions. John and I will try to make sure to get through them before the session ends. And so now let me introduce our guest for today. John Preece is the Chief Property Officer at Hub Australia. He is a passionate advocate for flexible work practices and is excited by the structural change in how organizations consume workspace as a service and the opportunities for knowledge workers that are presented to knowledge workers by flexible working. In his role as CPO, John creates commercial partnership arrangements with property owners and oversees the design and implementation of flexible workspaces, shared tenant amenities, and hospitality services in commercial office assets. He has over 20 years experience in commercial property and has held a range of senior positions in global property agencies, including Knight Frank and DTZ in Australia and CBRE in Europe. He has a multidisciplinary skill set, having worked across project management, occupier solutions, and office leading, as well as running Knight Frank's full-service North Shore agency business in Sydney. He is a fellow of the RICS and a Class 1 licensed real estate agent. John, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Marilyn.
I'm very excited. I don't know if I told you this, but I studied architecture at university. So the topic of the office is very, very close to my heart. Even though I never built many physical spaces, I still feel very strongly about them.
I feel slightly intimidated now. So.
You're the one who's been doing the real work in that space. And actually today, what we'll be discussing together is the role of the office in enabling flexible work. On LinkedIn, a lot of the conversation, honestly, today is about remote versus not. And I think it's become a bit of a binary debate. I'm hoping that we can bring some depth into the conversation today. I know that you're a big advocate that work can be more fulfilling when it isn't constrained by this binary vision of the workplace, and that there are many, many ways that organizations can help their employees to find the best fit in terms of space. And that's what you'll be talking to us about today. So I'm going to let you go over the presentation that you've prepared for us, titled Liberated Work, How We Can Unshackle Work from Place. And after that, I'll jump back in to answer some questions with you, but also I have a bunch of questions myself based on everything I've read about, your thoughts and your view of the workplace. So I'm very excited for that conversation. And over to you.
Fantastic. Thanks, Marilyn. So to get us underway, I just want to start by a couple of prefaces. Firstly, an acknowledgement that there are roles that cannot work flexibly, those in construction, those in healthcare, some tourism roles that need to be in a certain place at a certain time in order to fulfill those roles. But in the developed economies, around about half the roles that exist are office-based. And it's those roles I'm talking to today. The second preface here is that pretty much what's in front of you. Look, there are no facts, only interpretations. I borrowed that from Nietzsche. to put it bluntly, these are just my opinions. I try and read as broadly as I can. I speak to as many people globally to understand what is happening in different markets around the world. But really, ultimately, it boils down to a set of opinions that are mine and mine only. And whilst I have data to back up some of those opinions, we all know that data can be used to prove or disprove an argument. So please take everything I say and judge it with a critical eye. So what I'll talk through today, this future of work is a huge topic, and I've been asked to distill it down to 10 minutes and I failed. I'll try and get through this in 15 to 20 minutes, but what I want to do is just sort of recap on where we were, where we are now, where we're headed to, and then what does all of that mean for the office? What are the landlords doing around the globe? And how does space as a service play into that before the important part at the end and some Q&A. So where were we? Well, many would have us believe that in 2019, we weren't actually in 2019 at all. We were in 1950, and we were all trotted into the office Monday to Friday, 9 till 5 to do our work, because that was the only place that we could do any work. Of course, that's an absolute myth. We weren't in the office all of the time. The traditional office was pretty much already a broken concept that assumed that work was a place, like it was some sort of 18th century workhouse. In actual fact, office utilization pre-pandemic averaged about 42%. There was a study over a decade before the pandemic of 500 organizations across 27 countries, covering every industry sector, and the average utilization of offices pre-pandemic was 42%. So something like 58% wasted space. Work from home adoption before the pandemic was around 5% of the working week. So doing very, very simple maths, that means that 53% of the working week was other stuff. Now, either people weren't working, which I doubt, or flexible working was actually a thing already. And it just wasn't talked about. It wasn't written about. It wasn't publicized. It wasn't under the spotlight. But in actual fact, flexible working was actually a concept pre-pandemic. But of course, then what happened is COVID, the pandemic came, and most of the world entered into an enforced experiment of working from home. And by and large, it worked. The world didn't come to an end. Businesses didn't fail. Lots struggled. There was a lot of pain through COVID, and I'm not sort of brushing over that, but by and large, businesses kept going. And what that experiment did was it finally broke the shackles. It finally and convincingly unshackled work from place. And it proved that work is something that we do and not a place that we go to. And because of this, many people have continued to do their work without going back to the place. This data from Castle Systems in the US shows that currently the average utilization of US office space is around about 42%, 44%. But remember, pre-pandemic average utilization was 42%. Again, do the maths, that gives you 18% real occupancy utilization right now. That's 1/5 of the office space actually being used for practical purpose. But it seems that this exceptionally low utilization is not due to health concerns anymore, because as we can see here, NBA games, so live sport, restaurant bookings, public transport are all back at around pre-pandemic levels. And this is not just a US story. These graphs might be a little bit hard to read at this sort of level, but this is Australian data. Here in Australia, our two largest cities, Melbourne and Sydney, currently see an office utilisation of 39% and 53%. So not dissimilar to the US. So again, realising that into pre-pandemic levels, do the maths. Australia is also at about 1/5 utilisation. On the right-hand side there, that's restaurant utilisation, restaurant booking data. So seated reservation utilisation. And staggeringly in Australia, our restaurant utilisation is 100 to 150% higher than it was pre-pandemic, 2 to 2.5 times as many people eating out. So it seems that long COVID in Australia, at least makes people hungry. Now, the reason for low office utilisation is because the office has essentially, the traditional office has essentially lost its purpose. The office was necessary in the past because the work done in an office was paper-based. It had to be done on paper in the office. The paper was stored in the office, and to access the paper, to review the work, you had to be in the office. And of course, we've moved past that a long, long time ago. The technology now allows us to access the work wherever we are. So that's kind of rendered that purpose meaningless, and therefore it's rendered the office meaningless. And despite 4/5 of people no longer attending an office, there's been no loss of productivity. In fact, there is some data coming out of Stanford from Nicholas Bloom to suggest that productivity is lifted by 8%, and the average increase in company profitability has risen by 10 to 20%. So productivity has actually gone up. Unemployment is at an all-time low across most markets. I don't know where all the people went because this is across the globe, but unemployment is at an all-time low. It's hard to find employees. So the employment market is very hot at the moment. And employers won't tolerate conditions that don't suit them because they don't have to anymore. As a result, quit rates are high, and they're forecast to stay that way. Here in Australia, I read a survey only last week that suggests that 42% of Australians are very likely to quit in the next 6 to 12 months. That's a huge number. But I suppose if I couple that back to the restaurant data we just saw, maybe they need to create more time to eat food. Pause for thought. So right now, more than ever before, the single most important customer group for any organization are their employees or their employee customers. Now, a multitude of studies have shown that workers provided with flexibility are happier, they're more productive, and they're less likely to leave. Now, all of those things are really important right now. So it's no surprise that most organizations have adopted remote or hybrid working. Indeed, only 14% of organizations have mandated a return to the office, and anecdotal evidence suggests that those mandates are having limited success. Interestingly, though, despite the apparent widespread adoption of remote and flexible working, only 9% of organizations, 9% of organizations have implemented formalized practices and procedures to support flexible working. So it seems that most are just letting this thing evolve. Now, for flexible working to succeed, organizations have to set themselves up as remote and digital first. Without that, any form of flexibility invariably will fail. So this sort of really low level of strategic intent around flexible working is very, very concerning. Now, perhaps for some organizations, my cynical mind suggests that it may be intentional. You know, they've done a flex wash approach in the hope that in the medium term, everything goes back to normal and everyone will be back in the office. For others, it might be poor management. But either way, without a level of strategic intent, flexible work will inevitably falter and potentially fail in part. Now, strategic intent around flexible work requires meticulous planning and a particular attention to 4 key areas, and in this order. People, the employee customers come first. They must take the priority. Culture, training for managers in this new way of work. We know that there are shortcomings in the abilities of managers to manage in a flexible world. Employee engagement, wellness, all of these factors around people are absolutely paramount. Secondly, technology. So technology has facilitated flexible working, but there are still so many organizations out there that haven't implemented suitable technology to fully support flexible working, along with the necessary training in how to make best use of that technology to maximize its benefits. Thirdly is time. Flexible working is not all about location. Asynchronous working is a critical component of flexible working. Employee customers want as much control over when they do their work as much as where they do their work. And then finally, space. It's critical, but it's last place amongst all of these 4. It comes after people, after technology, after time. I'll come back to space. Now, getting the strategy right is really complex because there's no fixed solution. There is no one size fits all, as it used to be or we thought it used to be in the past, where you get an office, you do a fit out, and it's set and forget for the next 7 to 10 years. One size fits nobody. It also involves every single area of an organization and relies on a continuum of experimentation, observation, adaptation, and then back to experimentation again. Again, there's no set and forget solution here. It is an absolute continuum of experimentation. But many organizations, particularly the larger organizations, really struggle with multifunctional projects, particularly those that involve every single aspect of the business. And some of them struggle even more with accepting the notion that experimentation is necessary. And experimentation of necessity will lead to failures, because that's where we learn the most, when we fail. But organizations, of course, in the past have looked for solutions. They need to know the solutions to every problem. We don't know the solutions here. It requires experimentation, it requires investment, it requires failure. There's also the significant question of who leads all of this, because it's way beyond the remit of the typical corporate real estate team. So perhaps there's a new role, and one centered on change management, on organizational psychology, and multifunctional project management, which sounds like a bit of a unicorn role because it doesn't exist right now. But the fact is, we're going to lead a lot of these unicorns as we transition to a world of flexible work. So where does space sit amongst all of this? Well, in truly flexible working, or liberated working, as I like to call it, the workspace is not a singular space at all. It's polycentric. It's a network of spaces to support the wide and varied range of tasks that an individual has to complete in any day, week, and month. And that network of spaces will necessarily change over the course of time as the individual's role and the individual's tasks change over time. And each of those individual spaces that make up that network for that individual must have a very specific purpose. As we found, the traditional office lost its purpose and therefore utilization is very low. Each of these spaces needs to have that purpose in order to get the utilization up. What does that mean for the traditional office? Seems like I've got a fairly dim view on it. Truth is, most of the traditional offices that I've seen really don't, are purposeless. They are the purposeless office. Now, according to Tim Oldman of Leaseman, the average home supports the average worker better than the average office. Let me repeat that. The average home supports the average worker better than the average office. So what that means is that the home deals with people, technology, time, and space better than the traditional office. Now, that's quite a damning statement. But when you think, and if you believe as I do, that many of the traditional offices that we see have lost their purpose, it's perhaps not surprising. Now, does that mean the office is dead? Absolutely not. But the way we use it is. The headquarters of an organization has to become a venue. Now, the term venue rather than office is much more than just semantics, because venues are selected based on purpose. Remember the offsites that we used to have. They're hosted at a venue. Remember the client lunches. You'd select the best venue for that client. The HQ venue is an experiential space for employees, for customers, for prospective recruits to immerse themselves in the organization's brand and to help reinforce the organizational culture. The HQ venue is significantly smaller, but also significantly better than the traditional office. It's a brand immersion. It has a brand immersion experience of an Apple store, coupled with the broad range of amenities, and importantly, the hospitality-led service of the best hotel brands. It's a place to meet, a place to collaborate and learn, a place to bring clients and recruits. And yes, there are still places to perform focused work tasks, but they are very much secondary to the primary function. Now, importantly, this HQ venue has to be in a building where the landlord does so much more than they've done in the past to support the success of their tenants. The landlord has to provide meeting and event spaces. They have to provide flexible workspaces to accommodate times of peak demand. And they have to provide services and amenities to support the HQ venues of all of their tenants. But of course, we can't focus on space alone. And there's so many other considerations at the moment. The 4-day week, there's a huge study in the UK now, around about 3,500 people working in 70 organisations, where they've implemented a 4-day week on 180-100 policies. So 100% of the pay, 80% of the time, but 100% of the productivity. We're only partway through that study in the UK. I'll be fascinated by the results. But again, recent feedback from that study is that 9 out of 10 organisations in that trial will continue the 4-day week beyond the trial period. We're seeing recruitment innovation. So flexible working means that recruitment is no longer bound by geography, opening up a far greater talent pool. For example, Salesforce is now recruiting by time zone rather than by location. We're considering the packaged workspace. So company cars, for those that are of a certain age, were once a perk, and they became packaged with salary because individuals wanted to pick their own car. Then there was a mobile phone. Once upon a time, organisations would give employees a mobile phone. Employees wanted to pick their own mobile phone and their own mobile phone plan. That got packaged. Here and now, we see organisations packaging hardware, like laptops. So again, individuals can pick the laptop that suits the best way that they work. Salary package. We're entering a phase of extreme personalisation as regards to the workspace, with these networks of spaces developed for individuals, but by individuals for their individual needs. So if you follow the train of thought, there is no reason why the workspace, the network of places, can't be salary packaged, provide an allowance to employees to create their own network of spaces to supplement the headquarters venue. We've got the magic of weak ties and broader networks, which sounds very ethereal, but there's sufficient data now to suggest that remote working and people working in a remote fashion has broadened their horizons. So when we used to go to the office, our network of people was those that we're in very close proximity to within the office space, the confines of the office. Break out of that, and all of a sudden we broaden our networks, and we may have weaker ties with the people in our networks, but much broader knowledge, better results. And of course, it'd be remiss of me not to mention the metaverse, although I must admit I struggle with finding a beneficial and practical use for the metaverse as regards the future of work. Now, I mentioned earlier that the shift in work practice, the headquarters venue, there's going to be a far greater demand on landlords to provide better amenity, better service, better flexibility in their assets than ever before. So where are they? Well, sadly, a lot of them are just yelling for a return to the past, urging people to get back to work, which is probably one of the most offensive statements that anyone could say. It's as if we haven't been working for the past 3 years. The quotes on the screen there are real quotes from real institutional investors in Australia, either printed in the press or quoted ad verbatim from conferences. And even when these quotes are put into context from which I took them, frankly, the message does not get any better. The final point has some merit, like there'll be a flight to quality. Yes, that's also a stock response from landlords when times get tough. So I don't see any innovation in that statement, but there is some truth in it. But property landlords have so much more to offer. Spaces are still required to support flexible work. Capital is still required to create wonderful HQ venues that employees want to go to bring their customers and bring their prospective recruits. Landlords can do both of these things, but they do need to evolve their offering in response to how space is being consumed, and significantly so, I would suggest. So this mismatch between the landlord supply right now and the way that organisations want to consume space has led to a bifurcation of the landlord-tenant relationship, and that's a gap that is currently getting wider and wider by the day. That gap has been filled in many markets by space as a service operators or the flexible workspace sector. That's an offering that is fundamentally based on service, amenity, and flexibility, which is the direction that the landlords need to come back on. Now, in most major cities around the world, flexible workspace comprises, it's about 1 to 5% of the office stock in any given market. But this is heading towards 10 to 30% of stock by 2030, depending, and that's a broad range, 10 to 20, 30%, depending on whose research you read. Personally, I sit around 15%, but however you look at it, going from 1 to 5% to 10 to 30% is significant expansion of the sector. And importantly here, look, there are great synergies between property owners and flexible workspace operators. Property owners have assets and they have access to capital. Flexible workspace operators live and breathe by the customer experience, because the very nature of their business means that if the service is not exceptional, the experience is not exceptional, the customers will just leave and go somewhere else. So there is a great opportunity for partnerships, but that's an entirely different presentation. Now, just to round out, these are the most exciting times that most of us will experience in our career in workspace. We're going through a revolution of proportions that we haven't seen since the Industrial Revolution, all facilitated by technology. And hybrid working is widespread right now, although the low adoption of the strategies to go with that currently give me some concern and could lead to some failures. And some might point to those failures and say, hey, told you so, flexible working will never work. But what we can say with confidence is things are never going back to the way they were in 2019. Marilyn, the fact that you're on screen suggests that I'm running over time. So I might wrap up there and leave.
You had a couple of slides left. I decided
well, I might keep going. Okay. So we're never going back to where we were in 2019. And look, in my belief, hybrid working is a pretty rudimentary step on the pathway to liberated work or omni-channel working. I know Marilyn is a favour of yours, but far more flexible work than is facilitated currently in hybrid working. Looking ahead, look, we're looking at a phase of extreme personalisation and flexible working strategies that are based around those 4 key pillars of people, technology, time, and space will be absolutely critical. And regarding space, look, my belief is that most traditional office space has lost its purpose and it needs to be replaced by a network of spaces available to employees on demand to support their flexible work patterns. My belief is that HQ venue remains a critical component in that network. So the office isn't dead, but the way we used it certainly is. The HQ venue, much smaller. You know, if we take the current stats and say 20% is used, like it's much, much smaller, but it's much, much better. And it's got a broader range of amenities. It's flexible terms. It's a place for movement, a place for meeting, and a place for connection. And flexible workspaces provided by landlords in those assets will be a crucial success factor, because there will be points at which there are more people than that HQ venue can accommodate, and they need to go somewhere, and they need to have confidence that they're going to be accommodated. So the landlords, the gap, the flex space, all of that is a bit of a mash at the moment, but it's evolving really rapidly. And you know, I personally, whilst the future of work just became really complex, I think that presents opportunities for anyone in workspace right now that are really exciting. And I think most importantly and most fundamentally, the reward of all of this leads to a significantly better work experience for the generations that follow. So let's embrace this and let's give it a good run. Thank you.
Brilliant. That was an amazing presentation. I also see some comments from the audience who also greatly enjoyed it. I have a million questions as a follow-up. I know I'd already prepared a few questions, but also hearing you speak has inspired a bunch more. Let's go through them in like maybe trying to keep with the order that you presented in, and then and seeing where that takes us. I know that you've presented a lot of fantastic data around, you know, the office occupancy rate. I particularly enjoyed the comparison to the NBA matches as well as restaurants. I thought that was a very, you know, very intelligent way of looking at this. I wonder, you know, when I look at the data in other countries, like for example, and particularly I want to say outside of Anglo-Saxon cultures, I think that when we look at data from the US or the UK or Australia, there's a lot of comparable tendencies there, whether it's the Great Resignation, whether it's office occupancy, whether it's the perspective on flexible work, the demand for flexible work coming from employees. I'll just tell you that, I mean, obviously our data is on much smaller samples, but when we look at data from our part of the world, where cultural dimensions are also different, community matters more than the individual. There's different relationships to hierarchy. There's a few things that differ from here to there. We don't see the same numbers necessarily. And in fact, we see a lot of demand for the office as a space for individual work still. One of the stories that I can relate here is for one company where we supported them with rethinking their office. We were quite surprised, in fact, to hear that, for example, members of families who live in multi-generational homes, which is quite common for people from India or the Arab world, in fact, could not and did not want to do work from home. What's your perspective on like how global this is versus how much there's like local variation?
Yeah. I think there are two layers to this, and that's a wonderful question to lead into that. Firstly, I think the global demand from employees for flexibility seems to be fairly homogenous in the sense that employees everywhere want to be trusted to make the right choices, and they do that by being granted flexibility. That's an employer saying, "Hey, I trust you to make the right choices." Now, the next layer down is what choices do they then make and what flexibility suits them. In your part of the world, there are nuances. I was reading only yesterday of some apartments in Japan that are 95 square feet, which is staggering. Clearly, there are constraints for individuals. Now, their version of flexibility might be something entirely different to those in Australian suburbs with big houses and a home office. But the underlying demand for more flexible work it seems to be consistent across all geographies. Now, spin that network diagram they put up and give that to someone in Japan, in your part of the world, in suburban New York, or in the north of England, you'll get different requirements for that network. And some people will just say, "Hey, the office is really close to home. That's the best place. I want to go there. It's a nice place." Yeah. And some people will say, "Hey, that hour and a half commute every day, I'll do it one day a week, but really, I don't need to go there." So there are going to be nuances at a local level, absolutely. But I think what we're seeing is this overwhelming demand for it's not just flexibility, but trust and choice.
Yeah, I think that's a really beautiful point that you're making, that flexibility. And that's, something that's really important for everybody to hammer in. Like, flexibility is not just about work location choice. It's about timing. It's about the nature of your contract and relationship to the organization. It's about your processes and your ways of working. It's all encompassing. And I also always find it interesting. Like, I don't know if there's any data around that, but I think that the demand for work location flexibility might also vary greatly depending on the geography of the country, meaning how big it is. In a place like Dubai, we have 10 million people in the whole of the UAE, and like the whole country, like an hour and a half takes me to the other city at the other edge of the country. Certainly our relationship to space and distance in a place like this, or in a place like Lebanon that's also equally small, is vastly different to in places like Australia or the US, where distances, we must not forget that geography still plays a role. I think sometimes we just forget about that. Speaking of it is about flexibility. It's not just about, location, and this has to kind of be ingrained. I know earlier you had a slide around, people, technology, etc. Just talk to us about your view. Like, what are the 4 or 5 things that employers need to look at when they have this, flexible first approach to work? What do they, in addition to rethinking their physical workspace, what else should they be rethinking?
Without being bland, everything. It's most, and I come from a point of assumption there, by the way. So, most organizations are set to be office centric, and there are many organizations, as I alluded to there, that have gone, we'll go hybrid, that's fine. And they've kept all of their policies, procedures, technology, their assumptions around when people work, all the same. Now, that's a significant mismatch when you try and let people work flexibly with a whole system that's set up for the office. Now, that they kind of got away with that during the pandemic, because you basically shifted, people were still in one place. everyone was in the office, then everyone was in their home. Yes, their own homes, not one home, but they were all at home. But now we've got this dimension where we need to experiment because people are all in different locations. So the notion that you can continue with all of your office centricity and just let people kind of roam around like free-range chickens, it's just set for failure. And that's why I sort of, there's so much you've got to cover. I try to put some structure around that and go, okay, well, what do you want to achieve for your people? Each organization might be slightly different. Their people will be different. Each individual is different. What do we need to achieve? What technology do we need to support those people? So it's coming back to the people. What technology do we need? What does asynchronous work look like in our organization? Because if everyone just says, oh, I'll just work when I want, well, that's a recipe for disaster as well. You need some sort of some rules and guidelines around that. And then finally, once all of that is set, what spaces do we need to support these activities? Now, I know I've sort of gone back to something I just presented, but really, I think if you work through that in a methodical manner, yeah, methodical manner, it's going to draw the answers that you need for your organization, because you can't blandly say that the property real estate business will be the same as the healthcare business will be the same as the biotech sales business. They're all going to have nuances, but fundamentally what worries me most is that a lot of organizations have gone, oh well, it kind of worked in COVID when everyone was somewhere else, so it'll work now. And of course it won't, because everyone's everywhere.
Yeah, I see that a lot. I mean, the way that we talk about this with the people that we help is, including people who are, obviously, if they come to us, it means they are actively rethinking how flexible work works for them. But there's always, of course, the problem of complexity and budget and touch points and so on. And so they may sometimes be starting with one touch point, like improving their process or fixing their technology infrastructure or redesigning their office. And the metaphor that we use for them is like, this is like upgrading a network. You can't just upgrade one antenna. It won't work on its own, right? And so making sure that all of these things are sending out the same vision of work is very, very important. But I do have two follow-up questions to what you were just saying. One is there a company that you've seen do this incredibly well that you just want to highlight their story?
I'll say no. But only because my belief is the experimentation's only just started.
I see.
I think there are some good sentiment coming out of some organisations, but I don't think we'll know how it's gone and how well it's going for a year, 18 months, 24 months, when we look at attrition rates, when we compare what the organisation says versus what the employee experience actually is. But there's a couple that are certainly saying the right sort of things that, as an employee, if I were an employee of those organisations, I would be encouraged. Spotify would be one, large global organisation who have, clearly come out and said, look, yes, we have venues for you to come to, but hey, work where you work best. And
actually, I'm very happy that we'll be having, it's not yet in our lineup, but we just confirmed this last week. Actually, we're going to have someone from Spotify come and present their case study. So for those of you who are listening in and want to really dig deep into how Spotify does it, we'll announce that later today.
How's that? We didn't even set that one up. And there's a slight edge of bias there as well, because Spotify's Australian office is in one of the hub spaces that we have. So they've kind of worked out what's right.
Bias, or is it like great minds meeting? You don't know.
I think another one would be Amazon, and I picked them due to just sheer scale. Like, if an organisation of their scale can pull flexible work off and do it well, there is no excuse for any other organisation in the world. Again, they're starting the journey now. There's an acknowledgement from the CEO there. It's kind of like, we don't have the answers. We're going to let you work flexibly. We're going to experiment, and we'll see how it goes.
On behalf of like 1,500,000 people, like it's so impossible that you kind of let the system design itself, which is also a very smart approach. And then you earlier mentioned, I think, a very pragmatic, in my view, way of looking at the future of the office, which is, let's think about the activities, let's think about work, and take it down to activities that we need to perform, and then make a list of the ones that we still have to do in the office, and then redesign or rethink the office around that and the HQ. And I know you mentioned the HQ is a event-centric hub, but I just want to talk through a little bit of what activities do you think are not going to be, let's say, disintermediated by technology or flexibility? Like, what activities do you think are going to remain core to us coming together in a physical space that is owned by the organization, or if not owned, at least branded by the organization?
So if I took an extreme view, I think everything that we do with knowledge work can be replaced by technology. I also don't hold that view. I think, the purpose of coming together is to build relationships. And to strengthen relationships and to maintain relationships. Now, yes, some of that can be done online. If you meet someone twice a year and then you meet them once a month online or more frequently, you can maintain a relationship that way. But my personal belief is that being in person is a fundamental human instinct, and that's how we build and develop relationships. Now, I separate that from organizational culture. I read a lot of things that say we need to get together in a space because that's how we make culture. Like, it's not. That's how you build relationships. And through those relationships, you might share values and share behaviors that assist in the building of culture. But just throwing people in a space, as has been proven in the past, does not build organizational culture. But to answer your question, the value of spaces, whether they're branded or third-party spaces or whatever, is to bring people together, to build relationships. And when you've got strong relationships with other people, you'll do better work with them, you'll socialize better with them, and you'll just have a more enjoyable experience in your work. And that's what this is all about, employee experience.
Brilliant. Actually, there was a question in the audience earlier, and I kind of had a comparable one, which was, what are some interesting, or the question in the audience is creative space from a network of spaces that you've seen or suggested, meaning like, a typology of space or a use of space that surprised you or that you'd like to share that is like original or unique, or that has been enabled in this kind of distributed or limitless workplace vision. Like, is there something that you're like, see, this is a really interesting use of what workspace looks like?
One that was interesting for me, and again, it's a personal experience one, so take it with that bias. There's a global biotech business called Amgen, and their headquarters here in Australia was 2,500 meters for about 200 people from recollection, so about 25,000 square feet. Now, they had a lease expiry during COVID, and led by their people and culture team, had a very firm view that they needed to provide something different in order for people to be encouraged to come together, and let their lease expire, and they actually moved into a flexible workspace. The bias comes from the fact that it's a hub flexible workspace. So that's one of ours. I thought that was a pretty unique move for an organization of that scale, where that space is their headquarters, and in an organization where they hadn't done that anywhere else in the world. So pretty impressive move first up, but also complete acknowledgement that that's an experiment. We hope it goes well. Hey, if it doesn't, we tried. And but some of the fundamentals there. So 200 employees, I'll round the numbers. 200 employees. The space that they took in our location will only accommodate 100. So if more people come, they just acknowledge that they'll use the shared spaces, the common areas. They maybe book the meeting rooms. When they want to have an all-hands event, we have an event space. They'll use the event space and they'll pay for the event space. If they've got large meetings, they'll book the meeting spaces. So they have taken this sort of, the core and flex, and also then looking at the network of spaces and handing those back to the individuals. Now, some of those people are salespeople. So naturally, they'll be in their car, they'll be at client spaces, they'll be at a cafe, they'll be at a hotel lobby. They'll build their own network on what they're doing. So, and some of those people have different roles, whether it's finance or legal, and maybe the finance people, they can work more from home because there's more focused work. So that is one that I really enjoyed looking at from the perspective of, first, a relatively brave move and an acknowledgement of an experiment, but also then allowing individuals to build out those networks, based on what they need as individuals, rather than the old one size fits all. And we've got this office, and you'll come here, and it'll be amazing, because they acknowledge that no one was going to come back after COVID, or few, if they didn't do something different.
That actually relates to another question from Rhea in the audience, which is just talking about the decision-making process from like a top-down or a bottom-up approach. She asks, how much do leaders need to kind of guide their people when they maneuver through setting up these flexible ways of working? You were just talking about, different teams making different choices about where they work from and so on. What's your view on kind of that relationship? I mean, leaders still need to lead, and they still need to make decisions. And then there is as well, of course, much logic to saying people just know what they need. So where's the balance there?
It's a great question, because if you just allow everyone to do what they want, it's chaos, right? That won't work. Flexibility does not mean hands-off management, allowing chaos to happen. You do need to, as an organization, you do need to, I would say, own the HQ space, like that's your space, make it amazing. But also you need to provide a framework of guardrails that will guide how individual teams. So when you hand down the responsibility to individual teams to make and trust them to make the right decisions for their teams, you need guardrails. Those guardrails do a couple of things. Firstly, they'll make sure that the decisions made aligned with whatever the company policy might be around flexible working, so there's equality. And then when those individual teams make those decisions within that framework, they can be certain that the decisions that they make, that have got equity with other teams in the business, so that everyone feels like they're being treated with an even hand. Now, there's a fine line between guardrail and policy. Guardrail might be, hey, John, we work in a flexible workspace business. We ought to come into our spaces because they're amazing, as often as we feel comfortable, as opposed to, hey, John, come in 3 days a week. Like those two statements say the same thing, but they're completely different. Someone says to John, come in 3 days a week, I'm affronted already. Well, you don't trust me to make the right decision. Whereas if you say, hey, we work in a workspace business, we should go there. It's amazing. Yeah, you're right. And I enjoy the spaces. Let's go. So I think guardrails are very different to mandates in whatever form that they are.
Yeah, that's a very fair point. Okay, I know you said, and I do agree, I mean, as a company that is fully remote and we don't own an office, I'm not going to come here and say that you need the office to create culture, but I have a different question for you. Even before the pandemic, actually, there was a bit of, talk around this thing that I'm going to present, which is that it is true that you don't need to be in the office in order to experience your company culture, but when you are in co-working spaces that are themselves very strong culturally, like you would think of the WeWork spaces, for example, that's what everybody knows, like WeWork versus Regus, right? Like still you're in a space, and space has impact on human beings, and we behave, and our, like our sentient presence is influenced by the space around us. And what's your thought on saying, like, and again, I'm saying this because this was a debate that I remember having even before the pandemic, which is, okay, sure, we don't need our office to feel culture, but if you're in an office, if you're in a space, you are de facto also, being imprinted by the culture of that space. I was having this discussion with Kerma, who works on our team, and in Lebanon, where she's from, she splits her time between working at home and working in a shared co-working space that we've provided as a company. And she said, yeah, it's true. It's funny. I feel like I have two teams. I have the Cosmic Centers team, but I also feel like I have a community and a team in the workspace where I spend my time. And it's a whole different vibe and culture and whatever. And I know what you're saying, Marilyn. So what are your thoughts on, okay, we're still going to receive some form of culture from the space we work in, and how should companies approach that?
You mentioned one word there that really resonates with me. I think a good co-working space, whilst the operator of that space will have its own culture, and hopefully it's based on customer service in some shape or form, that shouldn't permeate to all of the customers of that space. But what definitely should, because it's fundamental to any good co-working or flexible workspace, is the community. So we shouldn't confuse community with culture. Now, you can have a great community of a number of individuals and individual businesses who all have their own individual business cultures or organizational cultures. but they still operate in a community together. It doesn't mean that you go into a co-working space and therefore you sort of get, you get washed over with the culture of that space. If you do, I'd suggest it's a fairly peculiar, flexible workspace. But I think the importance there is that we've seen the flexible workspace industry mature. It's kind of like the hotels industry. You've got a 1-star operator with a basic offering and a 6-star operator, and everything in between. Individuals will align themselves with a certain operator and a certain brand where they feel comfortable because the community's got the right mix of people, it's got the right spaces that they want, they feel comfortable there. Feeling comfortable in a community and the team, again, to use your words, feel comfortable around that team doesn't necessarily mean you get stripped of the culture of the business that you work for. I think those two things are crossover, but I think they're also quite distinct in many ways.
I have another question around that as well. Again, because as an architect, I mean, I do still think that space influences culture, whether we like it or not. Another question I have is, a couple of weeks ago, we saw a petition by New York Times employees saying they did not want to return to the office. I think like 3,000 people signed it or something. And it was like particularly striking to me because I think that some buildings and through their history and their symbolism, they mean something. Like I would have thought that going to the New York Times building and going through that elevator and seeing the printing press, and there's a lot of symbolism in that experience. And I would think that, sure, if you've been a journalist for 15 years and you've gone to that building 100 times, maybe it doesn't impress you anymore. But if you're new to the organization, there is something about the history. Or for example, one of the oldest banks in the world still has like one of their buildings from like 600 years ago. There is something to be said about the history of a place. How does that fit within the broader kind of experiential strategy? What's your view? Because obviously co-working spaces can never provide that. We'll talk in a minute about real estate strategy and leases and how long should you stay in a building and so on. But there is something that as an architect, I can't give up, which is the symbolism and the history of space. What's your view on that?
That cuts to the very core of this HQ venue that I talk about. That is the essence of that. To take your New York Times example, that building, that heritage is part of the very essence of that business, and they should harness that absolutely and create amazing spaces, an amazing service, and amazing amenity around that, so people want to come in there. I think there are a unique set of circumstances around the larger global cities as well that are prohibiting factors for people wanting to come into the cities. New York's a prime example of that. Just the commute, it's just really, for a lot of people, really long and really unpleasant. But I think back to the question, like harnessing the very core of an organization and presenting that in the HQ venue in a way that really raises the brand and presents the brand in the way the organization wants it to be is fundamental. That's why my personal belief is that, like that, the office isn't dead. Like the HQ venue is a fundamental part of this network, and people will operate in all different ways. But there's this kind of central home that people come to absorb themselves in the brand, to enjoy that sort of heritage and everything that flows out of that.
I really appreciate that. I have so many more questions, but we're almost running out of time. So I'm going to ask you one more big question, and then we'll do our rapid fire before we wrap up. My last big question is, we talked about occupancy levels being, below 50% or so. We're talking about companies changing their real estate strategy to provide more flexibility and choice towards their employees. What do you think we should do with all the leftover space?
That's the $1 million question. I think what we'll see is that as organisations repurpose the space, leases expire, and going back to the point I made earlier, which is a true statement, there will be a flight to quality, and then there's going to be a lot of lower grade stock that just is obsolete. Like it has no purpose in its current form. And as we see over the course of economic cycles and the course of time, it will be repurposed, it will be demolished, it will be rebuilt into something else. Personally, I hope that we see a lot more mixed use CBDs, because I think that's where we're going to get vibrancy. If I think of like amazing cities that I really enjoy spending time in, places like Barcelona and Valencia, and like fundamentally they're mixed use cities. You can literally walk from your apartment downstairs, there'll be someone fixing a car, there'll be a supermarket next door, there'll be a cafe, there'll be a bar. Like there's all of this mixed use, whereas in a lot of cities we've kind of moved away from that, and you go to these cities on a weekend and tumbleweed. So
I think that's a really beautiful point, and I do think that rebuilding communities and cities is something that, again, we have an opportunity to do, and we've tried to over-optimize urban centers, and I think it's time to take them back to their organic shape in some ways, and I think that's a beautiful answer. There are a couple more questions from the audience, but I won't have time to ask them. However, you can go and answer them maybe later in writing. I'm going to take us to our rapid-fire questions to wrap up our session for today. I'm going to start statements, and I want you to finish them. The first one is, great EX is?
Trust and choice.
Beautiful. The book every leader should read today?
I've just read a book that I thought was fascinating. It's called Stolen Focus by Johan Hari. And it whilst it suggests it's all about focus, which a lot of it is, it covers a lot more topics than that. I found it really interesting. Beautiful.
The ideal workplace is?
I'd have to say a network of spaces, not a place. A network. A network of spaces.
Say that again, please.
A network of spaces available on demand.
Love it. And then the secret ingredient to great employee experiences is?
It would be purposeful intent. And it comes back to my earlier point that one thing that does worry me right now is go work flexibly, guys, with no guidelines, no guardrails, no policies, no procedures. That worries me a bit. Like purposeful intent across what does flexibility mean, but also, how do we then maintain and build and better our culture? Because that's what really adds value to an employee experience.
That's a beautiful message. Thank you for that, John. Thanks again for taking the time to join us at our 2022 Cosmic Conference. I really loved your insights and this conversation. And if I could, I would take another hour to do this. I learned a lot, and I know our audience did too. And speaking of our audience, a big thank you goes to them for attending and tuning in, whether they're watching this live or rewatching it in 2 years. We're very grateful for your time. The video will be available continuously on our social pages, on YouTube, on our website. We are also posting new content every day during the conference, but also we often post content the rest of the year. So join us on our website, cosmiccenters.com, or on the conference website, cosmiccentersconference.com, and enjoy all of our content. We work really hard towards it, and we do hope that you join us. And we will see you later today for our next live, talking about purpose and culture and values, which is a very good way to segue from your last answer, John. Thank you again so much for having joined us, and we'll see you soon.
Thank you for inviting me.